The evening carried a strange hush, the kind that settles when the wind has run itself ragged and all that remains is dust crawling along the ground. The boards of the porch creaked under her weight, her shoes worn thin, her hands folded against her dress, as though the act of holding herself might keep her from splintering apart. The light bled red across the horizon, a dying sun painting the prairie in the color of embers, and yet she felt no warmth. Only the weight of his eyes upon her, sharp and merciless, cutting into her like barbed wire. He stood before her with a jaw set hard, his hands on his hips in the posture of a man who believed he owned the ground beneath his boots and all who walked upon it. She had once thought him strong, strong enough to weather storms, strong enough to lead a life through hardship. But strength without kindness had become cruelty, and cruelty without shame had become a mask he wore easily. Tonight, he wore it as he spoke words she had long feared but never believed would be given breath. "You're no wife to me," he said, his voice flat as a rifle but against stone. "Too old for use, too plain for pride. What good are you but to shame me? Let the man out back have you. Maybe he'll find something worth keeping." The words struck harder than fists. She did not flinch, not outwardly. Years had taught her that silence preserved what dignity pride could not. But inside, something withered. She had weathered his coldness, the way he pushed her aside at gatherings, the way his eyes strayed to younger women with laughter in their step. But this banishment into the arms of another, and not just another, but one he considered less than a man, was not rejection. It was erasure. Her eyes lowered, and in the dust at her feet she thought she saw herself, scattered, brittle, waiting for the wind to carry her away. He turned from her as though she were no more than a coat hung on the wrong peg. His spurs clinked against the boards as he stepped inside, slamming the door. She was left standing, the evening pressing heavy against her shoulders. Out beyond the corral, the figure of the second man stood still, a shadow among shadows. The so-called slave, though the chains had long since rusted away, leaving scars instead of shackles. His skin, darkened by sun and labor, carried its own map of trials. He did not move toward her, nor away. He merely stood, hands at his sides, back straight as though a lifetime of bending under burdens had not broken him. Her heart thudded with dread. She braced herself for mockery, for the gloating smirk of a man handed power over another's discarded thing. She waited for him to claim her as his prize. Yet he did not. He remained silent, and in that silence, a weight of its own settled, different from her husband's scorn, but heavy nonetheless. The town had already begun to whisper. It did not take long for word to travel on dry wind. At the mercantile, women let their conversations still when she entered, their eyes darting and lips curling faintly, as though they could not decide whether to pity or despise. Children stared, unashamed, until their mothers yanked them away. A group of men outside the saloon laughed, their words drifting after her like stones tossed carelessly, given away, too old, not worth keeping. She walked on, spine straight though her knees trembled, each step an act of will against collapse. By sundown, when she returned, her husband was gone to whatever vice kept him from his home. The yard was quiet, save for the distant lowing of cattle. The second man sat near the barn, sharpening a tool, the rasp of metal against stone steady, patient. He lifted his head briefly as she passed. His gaze did not linger, nor did it drop. He looked at her as one might look at rain, simply there, undeniable, neither curse nor blessing. Inside, the house felt hollow, its walls echoing with absence. She lit a lamp, the flame trembling before steadying, and for the first time she wondered if it would be easier to let it gutter out. To sit in darkness, invisible, forgotten. The hours dragged. When night fell fully, she stepped outside again. The prairie was wide with stars, their cold light more company than people had been. A fire burned near the barn. The second man sat beside it, cross-legged, his face calm in the glow. Something about the stillness drew her. Against her own shame, she walked toward the light, uncertain if it was courage or despair that guided her. She settled across from him, careful not to sit too near. The flames snapped softly, casting their breath upward. He did not speak. She did not, either. The silence stretched between them like a fragile rope, threatening to break with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. Her husband's words echoed in her skull, too old, too plain, too little. The labels clung like burrs. She expected the second man to look at her and see the same, a discarded woman, unworthy even of pity. Yet when she finally dared to raise her eyes, she found no scorn there, no hunger, no mockery, only quiet, steady regard, as though he were waiting for her to decide what her presence meant. The fire cracked, sparks leaping upward. She lowered her gaze again, unable to hold his for long. Somewhere deep in her chest, something stirred. Something small, fragile, not yet named. But she pressed it down. Tonight, there was no hope, only silence. And so they sat, two castaways bound not by choice, but by cruelty, staring into the same flames, their lives newly entangled yet unknown. The prairie stretched endless around them, the night vast, the future uncertain. She wondered, not for the first time, if she had already been erased, or if, somehow, he saw a shape in the ashes that she herself could not. The fire whispered between them, and she did not know what he saw when he looked at her, only that he did not look away. Dawn spilled pale across the prairie, the kind of light that stretched long and thin, brushing gold across the grass and silver against the dew. Horses grazed lazily near the fence line, their breath visible in the chill, the sound of their chewing steady, almost like the ticking of a clock too big for human hands. She rose with the first birds, not from eagerness, but from the weight of habit. Her body knew the hours of labor, even if her heart no longer cared to count them. She moved through the morning as though she were still in her husband's house, tidying, fetching water, gathering kindling. The rhythm of survival did not change, though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Each step seemed to remind her of the words carved into her like brands, too old. They clung to her shoulders. They whispered behind her as though shadows had found a voice. She could not escape them. Behind her, she heard the scrape of wood, the low thud of tools being lifted. The second man had begun his work without fanfare. No greeting, no intrusion. His movements were measured, deliberate, as though time was a thing to be folded rather than hurried. The steady rhythm of his labor pressed gently against the hollowness in her chest. She felt him there, not as weight, but as presence. The days passed in this quiet way. She expected him to demand something of her, to reach for her as though she were property to be used. That had been her husband's warning, unspoken yet cruelly implied. But he did not. He gave her space as though it were something sacred. If she sat by the fire, he kept the barn. If she worked the kitchen, he lingered outside. If her eyes lowered when others approached, he looked away so that her shame would not deepen. At first, she mistook this distance for disdain. She thought he ignored her because he agreed, because he too saw her as unwanted, as too worn to be of value. But then, small things began to carve cracks in that belief. On the second morning, she found the water bucket filled before she had risen. The handle rested just so on the porch, the well rope neatly coiled beside it. She knew it was his doing. The third evening, when the hinge of the door caught and groaned, it was silent by morning. He had fixed it without a word. On the fourth night, she whispered something under her breath while stirring stew, an old tune she had not realized her lips remembered. When she stopped, startled at her own slip, she noticed he had paused too, listening. Not mocking, not commenting, simply listening, as though the sound mattered. These were not grand gestures. They were drops of rain on dry earth, soaking in before she could stop them. By the end of the week, the sharp edges of silence began to soften. She found herself humming again in the kitchen. One evening, she spoke of a childhood memory, how her mother had once baked bread with too much salt, and how she and her brothers had laughed until tears came, their bellies aching, even as her mother scolded them with a smile she could not hide. She had not spoken that story aloud in years. The telling startled her as much as it startled him. He did not laugh at her story. He did not prod her for more. He only listened, his face calm, his eyes steady, as though he knew the gift she had given him by speaking it. That night, when she lay down, she felt lighter. The second man revealed little of himself. He worked, he ate, he slept. Words were rare. His silence might have been mistaken for indifference by anyone else. But she began to see a shape in it, a silence chosen, not forced, a silence that held space rather than filled it. It was not until late one evening, when the fire burned low and the night stretched long, that he broke it. She had been watching the sparks drift upward, carrying prayers she had not prayed in years, when his voice came soft, low, as though it had traveled a long road to reach her. "I do not see you as too old." The words fell like a stone into still water, rippling through her, reaching places she thought had long since dried. She stared into the flames, afraid to meet his gaze, afraid that if she looked she would find pity where she longed for truth. But his tone held no pity, only fact, spoken as simply as one might say the sky was vast or the earth was hard. She did not reply. Her throat would not let her. But something inside her shifted, small and fragile, a seed pressed into soil by unseen hands. In town, the whispers still clung. Neighbors still looked at her with sharp curiosity, their judgment like burrs on her skirts. Yet there was one who offered a different face, a widow who sold thread and flour at the edge of town. This woman spoke to her kindly, asked about her health, even pressed an apple into her palm one afternoon without a word. The small mercy startled her more than the cruelty had. It reminded her that not every gaze was sharpened to cut. Others noticed too. A young ranch hand, no older than 20, once lingered near the fence while the second man worked, his eyes flicking from one to the other. There was no malice in his watching, only curiosity, a kind of puzzled respect. He seemed to see what others would not name, that something unspoken was forming between two souls cast aside, something stronger than scorn. And so the days stretched into weeks. She carried the words with her, "I do not see you as too old," turning them over like a stone in her pocket, their edges smoothing each time. Her shame did not vanish overnight. The scars of her husband's cruelty did not fade quickly. Yet she found herself breathing easier when she sat across the fire from the second man. She found herself speaking more, even for words were small. And each time, he listened as though they were worth more than gold. By the close of that second month, she realized something she had not expected. In her husband's house, she had always felt like a guest unwelcome, a shadow trailing behind a man's pride. But here, in the quiet presence of one who spoke little, she felt, if not yet cherished, then at least safe. Safer than she had ever been. And it was in that safety that her heart, long silent, began to stir towards something it had not dared believe it would ever know again. The storm came sudden, sweeping down from the mountains with a roar that bent the grass and sent the horses shuddering against the fence. The sky turned the color of bruises, clouds swollen with anger. She ran to the yard, skirts clinging to her legs, hands already reaching for the laundry snapping loose from a line. He was there too, striding through the downpour with ropes in his fists, his hair plastered against his brow, his eyes sharp with purpose. Together they moved without words. He caught a barrel before it toppled. She dragged tools beneath the porch, both of them slick with rain and mud, their breaths sharp in the thunder's rhythm. When at last the worst of it passed, they leaned against the fence, soaked to the bone, mud on their hands, their chests heaving. She looked at him then, hair dripping, eyes alive, and for the first time in many long years, laughter burst out of her, unplanned, unstoppable. He looked startled at the sound, then smiled, soft, fleeting, but real. That smile caught in her chest like a lantern flame. From that storm onward, something shifted. Their days became a rhythm, a song neither had written, but both somehow knew. She carried water, he chopped wood. She cooked, he mended. They worked side by side, not master and servant, not punishment and punished, but as two halves of the same whole. Where her strength faltered, his steadiness caught her. Where his silence grew heavy, her presence lightened it. And slowly he began to speak. At first only scraps of thought, brief words about the land, about the weather. But then, when the nights stretched long and the fire's warmth softened his face, he let more slip. He told her of chains once heavy on his wrists, of the taste of dust as he walked behind wagons not his own, of the way men laughed as if his pain were their sport. He did not tell these things for pity. His voice held no plea. He told them because they were true, and because she listened without flinching. She did not offer comfort in the way others might. She did not murmur empty sympathies. Instead, she listened with the same reverence one might give to Scripture, her hand still, her gaze steady. When he paused, uncertain if he had spoken too much, she would nod once, quiet but sure, and he knew she had heard him fully. In return, she began to share what she had locked away. The cruelty of her husband. The years of silence where she learned to swallow words whole. The nights she had lain awake, wishing only for the mercy of being unseen. She spoke of the humiliation of being called too old, of being given away as though she were nothing but a broken tool. Her voice wavered, her hands trembled, but he did not look at her with pity. He looked at her as though every scar in her soul was proof of survival, and survival was its own kind of beauty. What had begun as punishment, cruelly handed down, had turned into something neither expected. A sanctuary not made of walls or wood, but of presence. Of two people who had known rejection, now finding shelter in one another. The town noticed. Whispers grew louder, sharper, carried on wind that always seemed to find her ears. In the mercantile, women murmured that she was shameless, clinging to a man beneath her. Outside the saloon, men laughed, their voices harsh, calling him less than a man, and her unwanted scraps. She bore it in silence, though the words left bruises no one could see. He bore them too. When taunted, he did not strike back, though his body carried strength enough to fell any one of them. Instead, he stood still, his silence louder than their jeers. His presence shielded her, never by force, always by certainty. She, in turn, shielded him not with power, but with belief. When others looked at him with disdain, she looked at him as though he were the only man in the room who mattered. And in that gaze, he found a strength no chain had ever allowed. There were nights when the cruelty pressed heavier, when her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of mockery. On those nights, he would sit closer to the fire, his voice low, speaking truths he had never given to anyone else. She began to learn the cadence of his life, the pain of it, the endurance of it. And with each truth shared, the distance between them closed. It was not grand passion that marked their first intimacy. No hurried hands, no desperate clutching. It came one evening, quiet, almost unremarkable. She had been mending a tear in her skirt, the thread catching against her fingers. He watched her, silent, then spoke her name. Not as her husband had, clipped and careless, but slow, reverent, as though the syllables themselves were sacred. Her hand stilled. The needle trembled. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and found there not just recognition, but honor. He had called her whole again with nothing but the sound of her name. In that moment, she knew she had been seen, not as too old, not as discarded, but as herself, worthy and enduring. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond them, storms still gathering on the horizon, the world still harsh and unyielding. But in the small space they shared, spring had come. Tender, fragile, undeniable. She did not need to say the word love aloud. It bloomed in the rhythm of their days, in the quiet of their nights, in the safety of his silence, and the steadiness of his presence. And though the world pressed against them with claws of cruelty, they withstood it together. Two souls, once broken, now bound by something the world could not name, and could not take away. The morning came heavy with silence. Fog clung low across the fields, turning fence posts into ghosts, turning the earth itself into something uncertain, half-remembered. The ranch seemed to hold its breath. She stood on the porch, shawl drawn around her shoulders, listening to the soft creak of the barn door as he moved inside, beginning his work as he always did. It should have been another ordinary dawn, but her heart thudded differently, as if it knew before her mind could name it. Hoofbeats carried through the mist, sharp and angry. She froze, the sound scraping across her skin like iron nails. Out of the fog he appeared, her husband, shoulders rigid, jaw clenched, cruelty burning in his eyes. He rode as though he meant to split the ground open, as though the earth itself owed him a debt. He dismounted in one fluid motion, boots striking the dirt with authority he no longer owned. His gaze found her first, cold, dismissive. Then it slid past her toward the barn, toward the figure he had thrown her to like scraps. So it's true, he spat, voice thick with venom. The whole town whispers, and I see it with my own eyes. My cast-off wife, clinging to a slave. And folk daring to say, he's more man than me. The words were knives, meant to cut, both at once. She felt the familiar sting of shame, but it did not hollow her the way it once had. Instead, it stirred something deeper, a quiet fury rising from a soil of all she had endured. He stormed forward, fists tight, eyes gleaming with the desperation of a man undone by his own pride. I'll put an end to it. To you. To him. I'll remind this land who I am. The barn door opened, and the second man stepped out, steady as ever, silence surrounding him like armor. His gaze held no fear, only a patience sharpened into resolve. He moved between her and the man who had discarded her, not with violence yet, but with presence. The air thickened, heavy with dread. Her husband sneered, spittle catching in his beard. You think you can take what's mine? You think you can shame me before the town? His hand lashed out then, striking her cheek with a force that sent her staggering back against the porch rail. The world tilted. For a breath, she was the woman she had always been, silent, bowed, enduring. But only for a breath. She straightened slowly, fingers brushing her bruised cheek, her breath steadying in her chest. She stepped forward, past the man who had shielded her, past the fear that had bound her all these years. Her eyes locked on the husband who had broken her down piece by piece. No, she said, voice clear, low, steady as thunder on the horizon. You do not own me. Not my hands. Not my heart. Not my life. The words cut sharper than bullets. For the first time, she saw it. Hesitation in his eyes, the tremor of a man unprepared for defiance. His rage flared, wild and clumsy. He swung at her again, but the second man caught his arm midair, gripped like iron. The struggle burst forth then, sudden and brutal. The husband struck with fury, wild and loud, each blow fueled by pride. The second man answered with quiet strength, every movement measured, unbreakable. They crashed against the dirt, fists flying, boots grinding mud. She stood frozen at first, fear clutching her throat. But then she found herself moving closer, her voice breaking through the chaos, not pleading, not begging, but urging with the strength of belief. Stand, she whispered, her words for him alone. You are more than what they made you, more than what he says. He heard her. She saw it in the set of his jaw, in the unyielding strength that flowed through his arms as he forced her husband back. The fight ended not with a killing blow, but with a man on his knees, pride shattered, cruelty exposed under the dawn. Her husband spat curses, struggling in the dirt, but he no longer looked like the master of anything. His eyes, once sharp, now darted wild, like an animal cornered. She realized then that he had always been smaller than the shadow he cast. He stumbled to his horse, mounting clumsily, rage still burning but hollow now. You'll regret this, he hissed, though the words rang empty. With a jerk of reins, he vanished into the fog, swallowed by the prairie. The silence that followed was vast, broken only by the slow rhythm of their breaths. She turned, finding him standing there, face bruised, knuckles bloodied, chest rising steady. Their eyes met, and in that moment, no words were needed. The sun broke the horizon, spilling light across the land, burning the fog away. Together they stood, hand finding hand, the warmth of it grounding them against all that had come before. She felt the strength of his fingers, the steadiness of his presence, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel discarded. She did not feel too old. She felt eternal, as though love itself had carved her name into the dawn. And so the day began, not with fear, but with truth. An old voice might close the tale here, speaking softly, as though by a fire's glow. Age does not make a heart less worthy of love. Cruelty may try to bury it, but kindness makes it bloom again. And in the wide silence of the West, sometimes the truest love is found where no one thought to look.